Hello, BookTube, and welcome to Cimmerian September. This is a BookTube event debuting in September, debuting today, that was created by Michael K Vaughan, and I'll leave a link to his announcement video. It's wonderful, where we are going to read the Conan stories of Robert E. Howard in the month of September. You can use this Gollancz paperback. This is about 800 pages. This includes all of the stories that Howard wrote of his signature creation, and also fragments and a couple of poems and whatnot. So this is all the body, the whole of anything that was Conan connected that came from the typewriter of Robert E. Howard. There's also a 3-volume paperback set that came out from Del Rey, I think, that is the Coming of Conan, the Bloody Crown of Conan, the Conan. It's 3 volumes that do the same thing this book does. They present the Conan stories in the order that Howard wrote them, in the way that he wrote them. And the reason that makes a difference, the reason that's worth emphasizing, has come up on both my channel and Mike's channel, which is that long after Robert E. Howard stopped writing Conan or anything else, a couple of writers, Elsbrag de Camp and Lynn Carter, decided to bring the Conan body of work to the reading public and massively changed it while they did so. They finished drafts that Howard had not seen fit to finish or had not had time to finish. They stitched together the stories into a chronology, which Howard had very pointedly not done. And they adapted other things, too, bits and pieces that weren't Conan into Conan stories, and did not clearly dictate what they were doing. If you read in the fine print of the prologues or the prefaces to those old volumes, those old Lancet volumes, you might have been able to figure out, all right, some of this isn't Robert E. Howard, but the drawing line would never have been made clear. There were no brackets around phrases. There were no footnotes. There was no way for you to know, if you read an Elsbrag de Camp and Lynn Carter Conan story, how much of it was Robert E. Howard, if any. Those volumes introduced thousands of people to the world of Conan, to the Hyborian Age. They introduced thousands of readers to this character, but there's a strong argument to be made that what they did was wrong. A disservice to the very character and the very creator that they profess to love. Those books are out there. Obviously, I just got the whole stack of them at the Book Barn in Niantic, Connecticut. You can still get Conan the Freebooter, Conan the Warrior, Conan the whatnot. And it might seem scandalous in light of what I just said, but they can be very entertaining to read as long as you know what you're doing, as long as you know what they are. That's the main sin for those books, is that the readers, when those paperbacks were coming out, most of the readers didn't know what they were. They thought they were getting Howard. This is purified. It is the perfect presentation of Conan, and so are those Del Rey volumes, which have great illustrations, black and white illustrations all throughout. And this is what we're going to be doing in Cimmerian September. We are going to be reading Conan, the canonical Conan stories in their canonical forms, all throughout the month. And that's about 30 pages a day. That's possible to do. Whether you're rereading these things because you haven't read them in forever, since you were a teenager, or whether you're encountering them for the first time. You'll never have better company. There is no more fervent Robert E. Howard fan anywhere in the world than Michael K. Vaughan. And I wanted to talk a little about this to sort of orient things. It's a natural instinct of mine, because when you're a book reviewer, if you're a good book reviewer, the first thing you're going to do in your review is tell the reader what you're talking about. And I know that I probably don't need to do this on BookTube. You're all bookish people, but maybe some of you are enticed by Cimmerian September because Michael K. Vaughan is your favorite booktuber. It could easily be that you don't know anything about Conan other than what you've seen in the movies, which, has its ups and downs, but they're mostly downs. They're certainly not going to prepare you for what you encounter in the stories. I think that of all the booktubers I know, Michael K. Vaughan has the highest percentage of people who view his channel who also like his channel more than any other booktube channel they watch. I think that percentage for him is pretty high. So it stands to reason that there might be some of you out there wondering what all this is before you get into it. So I thought I'd make a little introductory video here. That's all. It won't be going over anything that Conan fans don't already know. But mainly, let's talk at the beginning about Robert E. Howard, who was born at the beginning of the century. He was born in 1906 in Peaster, Texas. And later on, after a bunch of perambulations, his family eventually settled down in Cross Plains, Texas. And I have been to Peaster, Texas 3 or 4 times. And the first few times that I went there, I asked just random people, shop owners, people on the street, bus drivers, if they know the famous writer that was born in this town. None of them did. None of them had any idea. I don't know if that's still true in Peace, Texas. I'm never going to be back there, so I won't know. But Robert E. Howard was born there. He grew up in Cross Plains. He was a misfit. He was a nerd. He was a voracious reader. He read everything by Edgar Rice Burroughs. I think you don't have to look far in these stories to see that, but also by everybody else. Anything he could get his hands on. His father was a doctor, and there was money for books, so he had ample amounts of reading that he could do. And, as I always stress is important, after a while, he had the bug not only to read, but to write. Not only to consume these things, but to give some back to the world, to pay it forward. So he started submitting work to all sorts of places, including to a periodical that I am guessing he bought eagerly from the very first issue, Weird Tales. I'm guessing that he was their biggest fan. It must have been a dream come true, a sort of dance in your bedroom, if REH were the dancing type. He wasn't. When he got accepted, when he got a story accepted in Weird Tales. And that happened in 1925. And he just kept writing for them, regularly. And he regularly got his work accepted, both at Weird Tales and elsewhere. This was, in the full flowering of the pulps, when the pulps were really hungry for material. A very second-rate author could make a pretty good side hustle from the pulp magazines, even when the defects of their prose were manifest on every page. I want to argue here, and just don't tell Michael K. Vaughan that I agree with him, but I want to argue here that there aren't many defects on the page of Robert E. Howard. What there are obvious. There are some ways in which he partakes of the attitudes, racial and social and sexual, of his time. And some of the other faults of his stories, both Conan and otherwise, have for a long time the phrase that fans of his have used to excuse them has been that they were committed more by haste than by a lack of talent. I'm willing to go with that. Absolutely. Absolutely. I might not love Robert E. Howard's Conan stories as much as Michael K. Vaughan does, but I yield second place to no one. I have been reading these things forever and loving them forever. And he kept writing for Weird Tales and elsewhere. He started in the mid-century, in the mid-20s, but he just kept going. And Weird Tales had a door open for him. He was a regular author of theirs and making fairly good money. And in 1928, he came out with a character called Solomon Kane, a two-fisted, pistol-firing Puritan. It was a perfect marriage of Robert E. Howard's love of historical fiction and his love of adventure fiction. Solomon Kane has the black cloak, he has the unsmiling expression, he has the stovepipe hat. He's a ridiculous character and an incredibly minor character, beloved only by the Dude Bros and Dude Bro wannabes that have always loved Solomon Kane to the exclusion of all else. I've spent the last 50 years telling those Dude Bros, actually, Solomon Kane is not cool. He's really dumb. He's a really dumb character. It's never gonna work. The heart wants what it wants. And then the next year, in 1929, he came out with a character called King Kull. Far more fantastical than Solomon Kane. No historical grounding at all, unless you count the lost kingdom of Atlantis, which, for the purposes of Cimmerian September, I should just add a quick parenthetical, Plato made up. There was no such thing as Atlantis. Okay, he made it up out of whole cloth. But in the Kull story, we get a different register. We get a king who came from nothing and who is a warrior at heart, not an administrator. He has administrators. He has a court and all sorts of things that he has to do, kingly responsibilities. But he also managed to have some pretty big adventures. And then in the following year, Howard came up with Bran MacMorn, a Pictish warrior. And he did lots of other writing besides this. He was freelancing all over the place aside from those characters. Those characters have achieved a quasi-immortality. There have even been a couple of King Kull movies. Mainly because they live in the shadow of the creation that was coming. Now, Bran MacMorn, the first Bran MacMorn story came out in 1930. By this point, Howard was making significant money. In 1931, he made $1,500, or maybe a little more than that, from his writing, from short stories, at a time during the Great Depression when the average wage worker in America was bringing home $200 a year. When if you had gone to a normal family of four, a dentist maybe in Minneapolis, and told him you can have $1,000 a year, you'd have thought he was on Easy Street. This Robert E. Howard was making $1,500 a year in 1931. By the time he died in 1936, he was making well over $2,000 a year by his writing. And now that went up and down. If you're a freelancer, that's just the way of the world. Trust me, I know. But it was on a genuinely upward trend. And right around the corner from 1936 was a boom in cheap paperbacks and a slight boom in magazine serialization and even the pulps that would probably have seen that number double. So when you think of Robert E. Howard, maybe you've seen a thumbnail sketch of him somewhere as this brooding loner in Crossplanes. He was a major figure in the pulp world. In the early 1930s, there were plenty of young writers out there in the world who read Weird Tales and thought, boy, I'd love to be a big shot like Robert E. Howard. That is absolutely true. And he became known to the writers of his time. E. Hoffman Price, his name is forgotten now, but he was a famous writer at the time. Howard met him in person, and Price admired his work. Clark Ashton Smith, also a name that has largely fallen into obscurity, also very much admired a lot of the stuff that he saw in Weird Tales from Howard, and most famously H.P. Lovecraft, whose name is immortal, same as Howard's. They became very good pen pals. They admired each other's work, although Lovecraft had his reservations about the creation that was coming. The creation that was coming in 1932. In 1932, Robert E. Howard brought out Conan the Cimmerian, Conan the Barbarian, and set this in what he called the Hyborian Age, which is vaguely chronologically situated roughly 12 to, I've seen people estimate 12,000 years ago, maybe as much as 22,000 years ago. Howard didn't give it hard and fast guidelines other than it was many, many, many centuries after the fall of Atlantis. So this is long after King Kull, but still before the beginning of recorded history. That's roughly when the Hyborian Age exists. So you're not so far away from recorded history that you can't have towering temples, cities with huge stone walls, extensive agriculture, extensive mining, extensive armies with, armor and whatnot. You're not so far ahead of recorded history that you can't have those, but you're still close enough to the Atlantean prehistory, this mytho-history, that you can have monsters and the occasional dinosaur, and sorcery will work. I don't want to belabor this too much, but in Robert E. Howard's view of the Hyborian Age is at heart very similar to Tolkien's view of Lord of the Rings, which is that our world is the denuded descendant of a more fantastic earlier world in which, yes, there was plenty of evil, but there was also magic, and that none of those things exist anymore. The hobbits grow up; they get taller and taller until they're just people. The elves vanish more and more and more until they're just little glimmers in the moonlight. Same thing in the Hyborian Age. This is a time that Howard set for himself. He cut out some of its delineations. He named some of its great and minor kingdoms. He gave it some of its physical landmarks, and he gave it its hero. Because into this world, with its kingdoms spread out like jewels under the stars, trod on sandaled feet Conan the Barbarian, a reaver, a thief, a slayer, a character of gigantic mirths and gigantic melancholies, who comes out of nowhere. He comes from the north. He comes from a northern kingdom called Cimmeria, a kingdom of barbarians. No large cities, no great infrastructure. There are a couple of kingdoms even further north than Cimmeria, but the Cimmerians held a place in Robert E. Howard's heart because he kind of thought that they were natural descendants of the Atlanteans. So a line between King Kull and Conan the Barbarian. And it worked. This had been the culmination of a lot of retinkering, especially with King Kull, and Robert E. Howard wasn't sure that it would work. The only thing he knew for sure, and I want to stress this because this is not retroactive. This is not, sort of gilding the lily by looking back in false nostalgia. We have this recorded contemporaneously, that Robert E. Howard knew he was writing something magical before the rest of the world knew that it was magical. He knew that. He felt something different about Conan than he'd felt about Bran McMorn, or King Kull, or Solomon Kane. And he told people that. He told editors that. He told friends that. And they saw it as well. Editors especially, they were the first to see it, that the first Conan story was something special. something that had glimmers of genuine genius, as one of them put it. And it just went on from there. Howard kept writing other things, plenty of other things, but he churned out 21 Conan stories. All the contents in here, 21 Conan stories, plus poems, plus fragments. And some of those Conan stories are, as to quote Amadeus of all things, they're as finished as any kind of epic fantasy story could ever hope to be finished. Some of them are absolute classics, instantly so. The minute you read them, you know you're going to reread it the rest of your life, and that you're going to think about it. And that you're going to judge later sword and sorcery fantasy by it. Now, I would argue, I'm not allowed to say this, of course, but I would argue that the John Carter of Mars stories by Edgar Rice Burroughs are the beginning of sword and sorcery fantasy. Because Burroughs makes a point of saying that there's science all throughout them, but it's not very scientifical. But that's okay. It was by his lights. We can certainly give the credit to Robert E. Howard for creating a genre. There were writers before him that wrote this kind of thing, but nothing like Conan. The world had not seen anything like Conan before. Those 21 stories are great. Almost all of them are great, and the great ones, the 10 or 11 truly great ones, are great in every bit. They're great in every action that they take. It's amazing. And all the more amazing for two reasons. One is that even while Robert E. Howard was writing these things, and he said of these stories, as he said of no other stories that he wrote, he was a classic manual typewriter pounding hack pulp writer. He didn't get all dreamy about what he was writing, except Conan. With Conan, he said, I feel as if these stories are being told to me by Conan. I don't feel like I'm inventing them at all. Even though he felt that way, by the mid-1930s, he was strongly considering abandoning them, abandoning the whole of the fantasy genre that he had almost single-handedly created. And for quotidian reasons. Because he didn't like the material side of that world. Weird Tales, but also other fantasy magazines and publications, but mainly Weird Tales. Weird Tales by this point had a decade-long reputation for being a little bit wonky when it came to paying its writers. Robert E. Howard was not happy with his word rate. How many you used to get paid by the word. You still do. In a lot of places get paid by the word. He wasn't happy with that rate at all. And he became less and less happy with that rate the less it changed, even though he was a proven figure. It was known to the editors at Weird Tales that he was selling magazines. He wasn't happy with the rate that he had, and that wasn't him being, all that. He wasn't being egotistical. He had a legitimate gripe there. He wasn't happy with the rate, and neither was his literary agent. By this point in the mid-1930s, he had a literary agent. Neither one of them was happy with the rate, and Howard wasn't happy either with the payment. Weird Tales, the editor would go rhapsodic, oh my God, this is so wonderful, I'm honored to take it, and then he would take it, and maybe you'd get a prominent place in the magazine, maybe you'd get a cover, maybe you'd get a couple of illustrations, but when would you see the check? It was weeks, months, even over a year later. That didn't suit Robert E. Howard. He was by this point becoming a professional writer, and not only that, but he had significant expenses. He had hospital bills for his mother that were falling on him. That money, there were a lot of claimants for that money. When I say that he was doing really well, making $1,700 a year, he had use for that money, lots of it. He was, let's just say, excessively devoted to his mother. And she had serious health problems. He was the rock and stave of her care. So by the mid-1930s, he was thinking, well, I might keep my hand in once in a while, but I really ought to turn to crime and westerns. Especially westerns, where those magazines were burgeoning, as we covered in one of Mike's other great BookTube events, June on the Range. They were burgeoning in popularity, and they paid regularly. None of this business of waiting a year for some eccentric editor at Weird Tales to finally cut you a check and maybe argue about it. No, you got paid right away. It could very well be that Howard would have left Conan the Barbarian for simple pragmatic reasons. That's one thing to think about. When you think about those 21 stories, that's one thing to think about, is that he might have just left them and become Louis L'Amour. He might have left them and become a fundamental figure in the writing of the genre of westerns, in a way that he's not now. He did write a lot of westerns, and if you read them, my God, you'll never read a western weirder than a Robert E. Howard western. I don't know if it's that he felt impatient and thought he was writing down to the market. It could be that he thought he was slumming, or that he was just playing which doesn't seem natural for this guy. He wasn't a very playful guy. This huge, beefy-faced guy that hardly ever smiled. He didn't seem playful type. Maybe he was playing in those westerns. Maybe that's what makes them seem so strange. They are strange. They are memorable. But it's not given to many writers to write an immortal character. Robert E. Howard wrote one in Conan the Barbarian. So one thing that I want to think about for those 21 stories is that they might have petered out for perfectly natural reasons. Robert E. Howard might have just stopped writing them. And the other thing I want to mention about them, that I'm sure I'll be mentioning in the course of this month, that blows you away when you think about it. Robert E. Howard was 30, and he was checking on his mother in the hospital. And he asked a nurse, if she regains consciousness, is she going to know who I am? And the nurse said no. No, she won't. And Howard, who had been what we would now call manic-depressive his whole life, had flirted with suicide and told people about it many, many times. He left the hospital, walked to his car, pulled a gun out of his glove compartment, and blew his brains out at age 30, 1936. Now that's tragic, and you really wish that you could go back in time and get him some help. Just get him some help. There wasn't much, but even an in-person sympathetic friend might have gone a long way. I'm not saying this greedily so that we can get more Conan stories. I'm talking just about the man. His mother died as well. They died within 24 hours of each other, I think. So she didn't long outlive him. And they were buried together. And so we don't have any more Robert E. Howard. We don't know. Would he have followed the market and written westerns all throughout the 40s? Maybe the 50s? Would he have returned to Conan? But the one other thing that I want to mention here about those 21 stories. I mentioned that Solomon Kane is a dork of a character, and all the dude bros are screaming. I'm sure Michael K. Vaughan is going, no! But he is. He's a dork. He's a loser of a character. And then you have King Kull, who's not a dork of a character, but is limited. Solomon Kane is a Puritan, for Pete's sake. You have to bone up on your English literature to even read a story about him. King Kull was a barbarian. He has the tiger spirit inside him, but he's, by the time we meet him, a sitting king. There's only so much that's realistic for him to do. Only so many adventures that he can realistically have. He's a head of state. He has to deal with tax commissions and agricultural reform in addition to everything else. And Bran McMorn, what's a Pict? You ask most people what a Pict is. Do I need to study History 101 in order to read these stories? But with Conan, Robert E. Howard hit on something perfect. Conan has no backstory. He has no deep allegiances. He is not yet a king. We meet him as a king, but Howard's genius is to show us hopscotch all around the different periods of his life that made him a king, that drew him there. And he doesn't know. There's no forward looking. The main ill of the Sprague Camp and Carter books is that there is a kind of forward momentum. But younger Conan has no idea what his future will be. Not from minute to minute, sometimes when things are really hot. And also, because of that, Conan is free. In a way that Solomon Kane is not, in a way that King Kull certainly is not, in a way that Bran McMorn is not, in a way that a lot of Howard's Western detective heroes are not. Conan is free. He's free to follow his appetites, his lusts, his hungers, his greed. He's free to follow all of those things. Barely has two pennies to rub together half the time. The reader, particularly the frustrated suburban reader who dreams of glory, much like the author, is free to read those stories and just wonder what's going to take into his head to do next. Knowing the whole time that he's not going to end in a gutter, he's going to end on a throne. That adds a glow to these stories that is hard to quantify. I think you will feel it. If you're reading these for the first time, I think you will feel it. And the amazing thing to think about, that horrible moment when Howard kills himself, it maddens me that so many editorial prefaces or comments about Howard say that he died an untimely death in 1936. Yes, he did, but it was by his own hand. It's right to say that. The amazing thing to think about that is that I've said that Solomon Kane is an imperfect creation. King Kull is an imperfect creation. Bran McMorn is an imperfect creation. What if Conan is an imperfect creation? We'll never know. What could Robert E. Howard have written when he was 50? We'll never know. Conan the Barbarian is the household name that he came up with that is still true today. You go anywhere in the world and mention Conan the Barbarian, and an 8-year-old kid who's never seen any movies that you know of will start to brandish an imaginary sword. I've seen that all over the world. Whether it's Sherlock Holmes or Tarzan or Conan the Barbarian, not so much. H.P. Lovecraft also achieved a kind of immortality. Cthulhu is well known, but not outside of reading circles. Some characters enter the zeitgeist. They enter the blood of the society, and Conan is one of those. But is he imperfect? In another 5 years or 6 years of writing every day, all the time, would Robert E. Howard have come up with something better than Conan? We'll never know. It's just amazing to think about, to me. And that is kind of just a rambly, I admit, but an overall introduction to this world and this character. That is who Conan is. He comes from the northern kingdom of Cimmeria as a boy, as a teenager, and makes his fortune in the world. Goes from here to there, sometimes a thief, sometimes a pirate, sometimes a mercenary, sometimes a warband leader, occasionally actually working for money, occasionally having a day job as a soldier in an army, and so on and so forth. A zigzag path that we, the reader, know will eventually lead him to be king of the greatest kingdom of his age. But he doesn't know that, and the stories don't know that. So that's kind of just a rambling introduction to Robert E. Howard and his signature creation. This is one of those times where I envy you if you haven't read these things, that you're encountering this world for the first time. And I hope that its magic grabs you. I really do, because that magic is wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. So we are going to, now that I've sort of laid the groundwork, we're going to go on from here in Cimmerian in September. I've already consulted with Michael K Vaughan just so that he knows what all of you know if I'm involved in any kind of an event. I'm probably going to overdo it on videos. Don't take it the wrong way. You can ignore them. Just pay attention to his videos. He's the expert here. But that's who Conan is. That's who Robert E. Howard was. That's what we're doing for September. Conan the Barbarian, those 21 stories. So at long last, I will wrap this up, but I will see you soon. Thank you, BookTube.